At 2:14 a.m., a dying patient in ICU bed 7 told me where to find money hidden in a house he had never visited. I have been a nurse for 14 years. 8 of those years I spent in the ICU, the intensive care unit, which is a place that operates by its own rules, its own rhythms, its own particular emotional logic that takes years to fully understand, and that never entirely leaves you even after you move on. People assume the ICU is defined by death, and they are not entirely wrong, but what actually defines it is the boundary. The ICU is the place where the boundary between living and not living becomes visible, where you can watch a person exist on one side of it and then cross to the other, sometimes slowly, sometimes in a single breath. I have stood at that boundary more times than I can count. I have held hands across it. I have spoken to people who were standing at its edge and did not know it. And I have learned, in over 14 years and 8 of them in that unit, that the boundary is not as solid as the textbooks suggest. What happened with the patient in bed 7 is the clearest proof I have of that, and it is something I have never been able to explain to anyone's complete satisfaction, including my own. My name is Christine Adeyemi. I worked in the ICU of a large teaching hospital in the northeastern United States for 8 consecutive years before transferring to a less intensive unit for reasons that are partly related to what I am about to describe and partly related to the general toll that ICU work takes on a person over time. I am not naming the hospital because I have colleagues there I care about and because the patient in bed 7 has family members who are still living and who deserve their privacy. What I can tell you is that it was a real unit in a real hospital, that I was a real nurse with 8 years of clean performance reviews and the deep professional respect of every physician I worked alongside, and that nothing in my training or my experience prepared me for what happened during those 3 days in February. The ICU I worked in had 12 beds arranged in a horseshoe configuration around the central nursing station, which meant that from any point at the station, you had a sight line to every bed. This was by design. In intensive care, visibility is safety. Each bed was separated from the others by glass partitions and curtains that could be drawn for procedures or privacy. But the default was open, observable, monitored. And every patient was connected to equipment that tracked their vitals in real time and fed the data to screens both at the bedside and at the central station. Heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen saturation, respiratory rate, all of it continuous, all of it alarmed to alert the staff the moment any reading moved outside the acceptable range. In the ICU, the bodies of the patients speak constantly through the machines, and learning to hear that language, to know when an alarm is routine and when it is urgent, to read the patterns in the numbers the way a conductor reads a score, is one of the core skills the job develops over years. I tell you all of this because I want you to understand that the ICU is not a mysterious place. It is, in many ways, the least mysterious place in the hospital, the most monitored, the most measured, with the most thoroughly documented environment in modern medicine. Every intervention is recorded. Every medication is logged. Every change in a patient's condition is noted with a timestamp. If anything unusual happens in the ICU, there is a paper trail for it, a data trail, a record that can be reviewed and analyzed and discussed. This is the environment in which the events I'm about to describe took place. I want that context to sit with you as you listen, because the impossibility of what happened is made more complete, not less, by how thoroughly everything around it was documented. The patient in bed 7 was brought to us on a Tuesday night in February. His name was Walter Sims. He was 67 years old, a retired civil engineer, admitted following a massive stroke that had occurred at his home while he was eating dinner. His wife had called emergency services immediately, and the response time had been good, but the stroke was severe, the kind that causes significant neurological damage, regardless of how quickly treatment begins. By the time Walter arrived in our unit, he had been stabilized medically, but the neurological picture was grave. The attending physician, Dr. Patel, reviewed his imaging and spoke with the family that first night with the careful honesty that good physicians use when the news is very bad. Walter might recover some function, but the damage was extensive, and the realistic probability was that he would not regain meaningful consciousness. Walter's family consisted of his wife, Margaret, who was 64 and who sat beside his bed from the moment visiting hours opened to the moment they closed with the focused, and desperate attention of someone who believes that sustained presence can change outcomes. They had been married for 41 years. She held his hand constantly. She talked to him about their children, about their grandchildren, about the garden she was planning for spring, about the episode of the television program they watched together every Tuesday night that she had not been able to bring herself to watch without him. She was one of those family members who make the ICU work harder and better simultaneously. Harder because their grief fills the room and you carry it with you through your shift. Better because their presence genuinely seems to help the patients in ways that the monitors can't fully capture. Walter's condition on day 1 was consistent with the neurological assessment. He was unresponsive, not sedated, simply neurologically absent in the way that severe stroke patients often are. His vitals were stable, which was something, but his eyes were closed and he did not react to voice or touch or any of the standard stimuli we use to assess responsiveness. Margaret held his hand and talked, and I monitored his numbers and recorded his medications, and did my job with the particular focused gentleness that patients like Walter require, which is the same gentleness you give to anyone who cannot speak for themselves. On day 2, something changed. I was at the central station doing my charting at around 2 in the afternoon when the monitor for bed 7 showed a shift in Walter's heart rate. Not an alarming shift, not a deterioration, but a change in pattern that caught my attention. I looked up from the station toward bed 7. Walter's eyes were open. Not fully. They were at half-mast, the lids heavy, the irises unfocused in the way of someone coming up from very deep water. But they were open. I went to the bedside. I spoke his name. The eyes moved toward my voice. Not dramatically. A slow, effortful shift in orientation, like a compass needle finding north after a long interference. But deliberate. He had heard me and he had responded. I called Dr. Patel. She came quickly and conducted a bedside assessment, and her findings were cautiously remarkable. Walter was showing responsiveness that his imaging had not predicted. Not full consciousness, not coherent awareness, but neurological activity that exceeded what the scan had suggested was likely. She adjusted her notes and told the family, carefully, that there was more activity than expected, and that we would continue to observe. Then Margaret cried with a contained, grateful intensity that I have seen many times in family members when a door they thought was closed opens even slightly. She took his hand and leaned close to his ear and spoke to him quietly for a long time. That night, day 2 going into day 3, I was assigned the overnight shift on the unit. The ICU at night has its own quality. Quieter than the day shift, but not silent. The machines continuing their steady conversation while the patients sleep or lie in whatever state approximates sleep for each of them. I did my rounds at midnight, checked every bed, noted Walter's vitals, stable, slightly improved, and observed that his eyes were closed again. I moved on. At approximately 2 in the morning, I was at the station when the monitor for bed 7 showed a change. I looked up. Walter's eyes were open again, and this time they were not at half-mast. They were fully open and they were oriented, looking at the ceiling directly above him with a focus that was immediately and completely different from anything I had seen from him in the previous 2 days. I went to the bedside. I said his name. He turned his head toward me. The movement was slow and clearly effortful, the movement of a body that had been severely damaged and was working hard to do something it was no longer built for easily. But it was deliberate. He looked at me, and then he spoke. His voice was barely above a whisper, rough and thin, the voice of someone who has not used their vocal cords in days and whose neurological pathways are damaged and imperfectly restored. I leaned close to hear him. He said a name, a woman's name. Not his wife's name. I knew Margaret's name well by that point, a different name. He said it twice, slowly, with the careful emphasis of someone who wants to be absolutely certain they are understood. Then he said something else. 3 sentences, delivered slowly and with visible effort, with pauses between each one while he gathered the resources to continue. I listened to all 3 sentences. I stood very still beside that bed, and I listened and I made sure I had heard correctly. And then I went to the nursing station and I wrote down exactly what he had said while it was fresh, word for word, because something in me understood immediately that I was going to need the precise record. I am going to tell you what he said, But first, I need to give you the context that makes it impossible. Because without the context, it is simply a confused old man saying strange things in the middle of the night, which is not an uncommon occurrence in an ICU and would not be worth telling. The context is this. Walter Sims had been in our unit for 2 days. He had been unresponsive for the majority of that time. He had received no visitors other than his wife and his 2 adult children, both of whom I had met during visiting hours. He had been in no condition to use a phone or any device. He had no access to any information about the outside world. He was, in the most complete sense, sealed off, a man inside a damaged body inside a monitored room, receiving medications and fluids, and the quiet conversation of his wife, and nothing else. What Walter said in those 3 slow sentences was this, and he said the name of a woman, I will call her Carol, which is not her real name, and said that Carol needed to know that the money was in the blue box in the garage, on the shelf behind the paint cans, and that she should use it for the boys. Then he closed his eyes and did not speak again that night. I stood at that bedside for a long moment after he finished. Then I went back to the station and looked at his chart. His emergency contacts were his wife Margaret and his son and daughter. No Carol listed. His admissions paperwork had been filled out by Margaret at intake, and it was thorough. Next of kin, insurance, medical history, advance directive. No Carol anywhere in the documentation. I noted Walter's statement in his chart with a timestamp and flagged it for the morning team. When Margaret arrived at the start of visiting hours the next morning, I asked her carefully if the name Carol meant anything to her in relation to Walter. She went very still. Then she told me that Carol was Walter's sister, that Carol and Walter had been estranged for 11 years following a serious falling out over their mother's estate, that Margaret had not spoken to Carol in all that time and did not have a current phone number for her, that Carol had 2 sons, the boys, who would now be teenagers. And then Margaret looked at me with an expression I have seen on the faces of family members many times, but never quite like this, and she said, "Why are you asking me about Carol?" I told her what Walter had said. I read it to her directly from my notes, word for word, the way I had written it down at 2 a.m. The name, the blue box, the garage, the shelf behind the paint cans, the boys. Margaret sat with this for a long time. Her hands were in her lap and she was looking at Walter, who was lying in bed 7 with his eyes closed and his vitals steady on the monitor above him, and she was very quiet. Then she said something that caused the air in that room to change, in a way I have never forgotten. She said, "We don't have a garage. We've never had a garage. We've lived in an apartment for 20 years. She paused. "But Carol has a garage. Carol's house has always had a garage. I have turned that information over in my mind more times than I can tell you. A man who had been neurologically absent for 2 days, a man with documented severe brain damage, a man who had no access to any outside information and who had not spoken to his estranged sister in 11 years. This man woke in the deep middle of the night and gave a critical piece of information about a location in a place he had never been, belonging to a person he had not contacted in over a decade, for the benefit of 2 boys he had likely never met. He had no way to know about the blue box. He had no way to know about the garage. He had no framework within which any of that information could have reached him through normal channels. Margaret found Carol through a family member who still had contact with both sides. She called her that afternoon from the hospital lobby, while Walter lay in bed 7 on the other side of the building. I do not know the full content of that conversation because it was private, and I was not part of it. What I know is what Margaret told me the following morning when she arrived for visiting hours. Carol had gone to her garage and looked on the shelf behind the paint cans and found a blue metal box. Inside the box was money. A significant amount of money in cash, saved over many years, that Carol had not known about. It was enough, Margaret said, to make a real difference for the boys. Walter died on the 5th day. His condition had stabilized briefly and then declined, the way it often does when the damage is deep enough that the body's temporary rallying cannot be sustained. He died peacefully, with Margaret holding his hand in the early afternoon. His passing was gentle and expected, and I was present for it, and it was, in the way that ICU deaths sometimes are, when the person has been cared for well, and the family has been present, and the goodbye has been given time to be a goodbye, as close to peaceful as death gets. But what I carry from those 5 days is not his death. What I carry is 2 a.m. on day 3, and a damaged voice saying a name and 3 sentences in the dark, and a blue box on a shelf behind paint cans in a garage the speaker had never entered, and 2 boys who needed it. What I carry is the question that has sat with me every day since. Where did that information come from? Not as a rhetorical question, as a genuine one. Where inside the wreckage of a severely damaged brain in a body that had been isolated from the world for 2 days? Did those 3 precise sentences originate? I have medical explanations available to me, and I have examined all of them. Confabulation, the neurological phenomenon where a damaged brain produces false but confident information, does not account for the specificity and accuracy of what Walter said. Confabulation produces plausible-sounding fictions, not accurate descriptions of locations and houses the speaker has never visited. Unconscious memory, the theory that Walter had somehow heard or absorbed this information at some earlier point and it surfaced under neurological stress, requires him to have had information he had no documented access to. I have not been able to construct a medical explanation that fully accounts for what he said and what was found. What I am left with, after 8 years in the ICU and 14 years in nursing and 3 years of thinking about Walter Sims and the patient in bed 7, is this. The boundary I spoke about at the beginning of this account, the one between living and not living that the ICU makes visible, is not a wall. It is permeable. Things move through it in both directions. And occasionally, not in the deep middle of the night when the monitors are steady and the unit is quiet, and a damaged man opens his eyes with a focus that has no medical explanation, something comes through that boundary that carries information. Information that matters. Information that was needed. I transferred out of the ICU 14 months after Walter died, partly for the reasons I said, the cumulative toll of that kind of work over 8 years, but partly because of something simpler. After what happened with Bed 7, I could not stand at that boundary every night without feeling the full weight of what it was. I could not monitor those numbers and hold those hands and be present for those crossings without knowing, in a way I had not known before, that the crossing was real and that something persisted on the other side of it. But that knowledge made me a better nurse, I think. It also made the work harder to carry home. I work in a rehabilitation unit now. Less acute, less boundary adjacent, more focused on recovery and return than on the threshold itself. I am good at this work, and I find it sustaining in ways the ICU ultimately was not. But I keep my notes from that night. The exact words, written at 2:14 in the morning with a timestamp in my own handwriting. I keep them because they are proof. Not of anything supernatural. I am still a nurse and still a scientist, and I do not reach for that word easily. But proof that the world contains mechanisms for transmission that we do not yet have instruments to measure. Proof that a man at the edge of everything found a way to do one final thing that mattered. And proof that sometimes, if you are standing close enough and paying careful enough attention, you can hear it happen.